Welcome to the Freedom Founder Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Duggar. I have with me today Dr. Tom Martin, who hails from Nebraska. He is a retired primary care physician who had moved into urgent care in latter years. I want to welcome him to the podcast today. Many think of the area of medicine and just variety of different opportunities that it provides. And so I thought it would be of interest to talk with someone who was in an area of rural area and private practice and then transitioned out into working as an employee and how that transition transpired over time. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Zach. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, I wanted to ask, and I prefaced this a little bit in prior emails, some of these questions, but I wanted to ask, early on as a child growing up, did you come out of a household or background with family that had been a medical doctor in the medical field at all?
No, Zach, the first person in our family to become involved in medicine was my older sister, Sharon,
Okay.
who was an RN. My father was a pastor when I was born and moved on to working at a Christian high school. And it was a while just before high school or during high school that I particularly got interested in medicine for, I think, two main reasons. One was our family doctor.
Okay.
Our family doctor was a man named Dr. John Campbell, who had been a missionary doctor in Africa and then came to our little town. And I didn't have a lot of reasons to go to the doctor at that time, but I had an injury or two that came up, and we also lived on a small acreage, and Dr. Campbell had a horse that needed a place to stay, so we boarded his horse for him. And so we had some interaction outside the clinic too. But I always admired him, had great respect for him, and then that combined with an interest I had in science and math classes, it seemed to be a natural fit. And I look back and say that I was first interested in perhaps going on to become a physician when I was about 12 years old.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. That starts young, that desire, that interest. That is something that I think a lot of people, especially those that I have talked with over my years, they had no idea what they wanted to do when they were 12 or let alone 18, 20, 24, 40. So
And that's not to say it didn't change a little along the way,
sure.
but I did
Yeah.
eventually come back to it.
Okay. Okay. So coming back to that, you started off in early childhood, growing up in a rural community with a family with a parent who was a pastor, and worked a variety of different jobs over the years. And you decided through that experience with your family doctor that you had that interest, that desire, that passion, that motivation. So what is it about being a medical doctor that you found appealing?
Well, it first of all, I think, was an opportunity to develop that interest I had in science
Okay.
early on. But I also liked the idea of doing something that was directly helping other people and an opportunity to uh, meet needs that
Yeah.
came with being a physician. And so I think it's just a combination of things. And uh, so, of course, physicians can go a lot of different directions these days in specialty care and all, but I stuck to family medicine because of the opportunity to encounter a little bit of everything and meet
Yeah.
all ages of people to care for.
Okay. So as you progressed through those years in medicine and we're getting towards the end of your schooling, um, private practice. When I think of private practice, I think of somebody who works independently of a large conglomerate.
right?
They but maybe they work for somebody else. Where did you work for somebody else? Were you your own boss? Tell me about that.
Well, when I was
How'd
in
that get started?
medical school and then on to residency, I uh,
Yep.
I met another young man that was in the same process, and we became friends. In the way our residency was constructed, you had to have a partner uh,
Okay.
because we shared some responsibilities in order to always have a connection to our family practice training, even if we were in a specialty for 2 months, which was a typical assignment, like then we still had responsibilities in a family practice clinic. So that was why we shared with a partner some of the responsibility. Well, he and I found common interests in interest in rural medicine, interest
Hmm.
in using our faith as part of our practice. And so it led to conversations. Well, what are we going to do when we get done here?
Yep.
And he was from the area of central Nebraska that we started talking about. And so we went to Ord, Nebraska, and started a practice from scratch.
Okay.
We considered other possibilities of existing practices, but for various reasons decided that we wanted to develop the practice that we wanted.
Yep.
And so that's what we did and started with nothing.
So did you have business training in school, or how do you start a practice? You know the medical side, but
Yeah.
tell me
Well,
about that because
yeah, it was definitely a challenge.
yeah.
We had an occasional lecture or presentation on business matters,
Okay.
but it was minimal.
Yep.
And we did, through that, get acquainted with a business consultant for medical practices. And he
Okay.
did help us with some of the arrangements of getting started in Ord. Uh, when you start with nothing, including
Hmm.
money,
Yeah.
uh, when you think about starting a new business, you generally have to have some capital to work with.
Yep.
And it turns out that we had one distinct advantage. An MD degree seemed to mean something to lenders.
Okay.
And so we were able to borrow money with a government guarantee, Small Business Administration backing, and then with some help from a couple of different advisors, we got a practice started and opened the door.
Okay.
And when you talk about an entrepreneur starting a new business, any kind of business, you go through a lot of preparatory work, and then you open
Yep.
the door and wait and see if somebody will walk in. And
Right.
we had been assured that there was a need in this
Yep.
area, um, but we still didn't know. And
Yeah.
as it turned out, it took about 2 years before our practice was generating enough income to pay ourselves. Uh,
Okay.
so we lived on borrowed money for that first 2 years.
Okay. Yep. So and it wasn't an immediate success story, people lining up out the door on day one.
No, my recollection is we had 19 people come in the first day.
Okay.
But then there were days after that when we had much fewer. And
Okay.
eventually, though, we had a very steady, well established practice.
When a practice like that with two physicians is in full operation and it's well established, how many patients would you have over the course of a year or in your kind of record for those that you're treating?
Yeah, I didn't do the math on all that. Uh,
Oh, that's all right.
typical,
Ballpark.
typical for each of us to see 20 to 25 people a day.
Okay. Yep.
During cold and flu season, that might have inflated. Uh, I do recall at least one day that we almost hit 50 each. Uh,
Yeah.
but you start seeing a pattern. You say, okay, you've got the
Yep.
same thing the last three people had, so you don't have to spend quite as much time sorting it out.
Yeah.
But we probably averaged 20 to 25 a day, and each
Yep.
worked 4 days a week, took 1 day off. And
Yep.
I can explain more about why after a bit. But that would have been pretty typical.
So thousands of people over the course of time that you were able to help and to support in that community. When you started fresh, day 1, 0, to go to that point over the next 2, 3, 4, however many years. I believe you told me 20 years in practice there, correct?
19 and a half.
19 and a half to
I probably said
be
almost
precise.
20.
Well, that's marvelous. That's life changing for yourselves, but also for that community to be able to bring that service into an area that clearly there was a need for it. And also that funding that you had mentioned, to be able to access funds that are are I think some people wouldn't realize are available when they are starting off in a business. And like you had mentioned, having the degree probably did help with some of that in getting the approvals. But seeking financing on the front end for some business ventures that require it is essential and necessary.
Right,
So,
right.
I mean, that's remarkable. I mean, I think about some businesses, and I guess in regards to that private practice physician, only thing you think about is they're probably going to be successful right out the gates, and but that doesn't mean there wasn't work that's involved to get there.
Well, that's true. That's true. One other point I might share,
Yeah,
we're talking about something that happened just over 40 years ago.
sure.
1981 was when we moved to Ord.
Yeah.
And if you studied the economics of that time period, we were borrowing money at 16% interest.
Oh, wow.
We bought a
That
house, and the owner was willing to finance it to start with and gave us a break at 14%.
wow.
So,
That's remarkable, and there's concerns today about the interest rates increasing
right,
when you compare
right,
to that time frame.
right. I
That's
never
still a
want to
far
see it.
cry.
Yeah, I never want to see it again,
Oh no, definitely not. And
unless it's
I
what they're paying on my savings account.
yeah, right. If only. Yeah, I mean, I've experienced that working with the Small Business Administration. I think the loan that we had for a period of time was 3%, 4%.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
oh man, wow, that's remarkable.
yeah.
Well, you'd mentioned briefly that your schedule was such that you worked 4 days and had the other day off. And let's go back to that. Tell me about that schedule.
Well, the other thing about rural medicine is that you essentially have to be available 24 hours a day.
Okay.
Uh, Now, again, we would divide that between two of us,
Yep.
and later with physician assistants helping out as well.
Yep.
But there frequently times that you would get called during the night, and we
Yep.
covered the emergency room. And
Okay.
during our time in Ord, uh, 3 surrounding small community hospitals closed, and
Hmm.
that increased the flow of patients to our hospital,
Yeah.
especially through the emergency room.
Could
At one
imagine.
time, I was medical director for 7 emergency medical system operations that would bring
Wow.
patients to our hospital.
Wow.
And so, in order to try and help compensate for that, then we took 1 day off.
Yep.
And
Yeah. I mean, when you do that math, that 32 hours and 4 days that somebody might think that's actually 96 hours when you go 24 hours, including the on-call time. But
right,
yeah, I can definitely understand that.
yeah,
So early on in starting in business in an area that your primary background and education was in medicine, and treatment, and medicine.
right.
Um, you guys had some business consulting, you had some business seminars. What is a big lesson learned early on in running and operating a business?
Well, you certainly quickly learn that there's more to the overhead than you may have imagined.
Okay.
Uh, and I remember one good example of what we learned when we had an accountant who did a good job helping us too with bookwork. or
Yep.
bookkeeping. And there was always a line item in our expenses for depreciation expense.
Yep.
And initially, it didn't even occur to me what that meant. Uh,
Yep.
and so if we were a little behind on meeting our requirements, it seemed, well, we had a little cushion there that we didn't really need cash for that depreciation expense.
Yep.
Well, eventually you do.
Mm-hmm.
And we did. We bought, when we opened, we bought a used X-ray machine,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually we had to replace that with a new machine. Well, that's
Yep.
depreciation expense, and so remembering to make allowances for things that are going to break down or need to be replaced, or you're expanding, or
Yep.
technology says it's time to buy a computer, which that also came during our time in Ord. And
Yep.
no computers for the first 8 or 10 years.
Right.
Uh, but eventually that became an important part of it. But all of those things add to the overhead. Uh,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's probably the biggest thing. And, meeting the payroll, making sure all
Mm-hmm.
the bills are paid, supplies are ordered. Uh,
Yep.
we were able to surround ourselves with good help. Uh,
Yep.
we had excellent employees, most of whom stayed with us a long time, and that made a lot of difference.
Absolutely. That's great. And I think that's a very, very solid point. I think sometimes in business we think about the day-to-day operational expenses, but don't always remember or consider or plan for those future expenses that we will have when we have
Right.
to replace something breaks down. So having
Yeah.
those operating reserves and building up that bank account that will be there for those situations in which your plan for expansion occurs, your need for new technology occurs, your need for replacement. So yeah,
Right.
definitely definitely a valuable lesson right there. But you went from private practice then at that 19 and a half year mark to move to Lincoln and to actually work for an organization. Tell me about that transition. Why was that decision made? And also, what were the big differences you saw in being in private practice versus being an employed physician?
Well, the transition really started 3.5 years before we left Ord.
Hmm.
Uh,
Okay.
but when our kids were close to graduating from high school, and we started to think a little differently about the future. And honestly, the demands of rural practice were wearing on not just me, but my wife.
Sure.
We started talking about what might be an alternative.
Yep.
And the alternative started with being offered an opportunity to sell my practice.
Yep.
And so I ended up selling my practice to a hospital 60 miles away.
Hmm.
And part of the agreement then was I would continue to work for them for at least 3 years.
Okay.
So I became an employed physician
Okay. Yep.
before leaving Ord
Yep.
to help that transition happen. And then when we got past the 3 years, uh, an opportunity came through a connection because I was now employed by this hospital. Uh, Found out about an urgent care position open in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yep.
And so checking that out, one of the most attractive things about that would be I would work scheduled hours. I
Right.
would have no night responsibility, no hospital responsibility. And that was for the first time since the middle of medical school that I wouldn't have nights and weekends. Well, I would still work weekends, but it'd be scheduled hours. So if I'm working
Yep.
weekend, that means I may have 2 or 3 days off during the week.
Right.
So that's how that came about. And yeah, I became an employed physician of
Yep.
a hospital system.
Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't even think about that fact. There is that transition and a overlap in during that transition with your time in Ord as well. During that time of that overlap, were there any challenges that relate to the fact that you were no longer the owner of that practice that you had to just pull back and say, okay, this is their decision, or was it pretty
You
smooth?
know, it was really pretty smooth.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
I felt in some ways a certain amount of relief, uh, and there were a couple of situations I know that affected employees now because they also were employed by this
Yeah,
system, and I I knew we were losing a little bit of the personal touch with our employees, uh, and that was a little uncomfortable. But
yeah,
it didn't turn out to be major, and I had support from them for making the change, so
yeah.
it worked out.
Excellent. Well, I have two more questions for you. One being in regards to your definition of success. I just wanted to inquire what your perception is on success and how you define it, because so many people define it in so many different ways. So, what is success to you?
Well, I think you first think, well, it must be financial success, but I think it's more fulfilling what we set out to do, and that was
Yep.
to minister to people's needs through healthcare, and we were successful in doing that. Um,
Yes.
in rural practice, there's always great challenges that come up, confronted with situations that we were not well prepared to handle.
Yep.
Sometimes I was very happy to hear the sound of the helicopter coming in to transport a patient to another hospital.
Sure.
But I did feel that we succeeded in what we set out to do with our medical practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you've been able to continue some of that in even work outside of the United States in other capacities and helping and serving using your medical experiences. Is that correct?
Yes, we became acquainted with a missionary in Mexico through my brother-in-law, who was a pastor, knew this
Yep.
missionary, and I went down with his church group one time and found very interesting to think about how we might use medical care to also meet spiritual needs.
Yep.
And so for 10 years, we made a trip every year,
Yeah.
spent a week doing medical clinics in churches in tiny towns in Mexico. And that was very rewarding.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the reason we had to quit going was the missionary felt it had become too dangerous in the area they were
Okay.
working because
Yep.
of the drug cartel problem in Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah. What a blessing though you're able to serve in that community for the time you did. Well, one last question I have in that, and this is a little different because you are no longer in this operating role as a business owner, but if you were to have been given $1 million to put into your practice in any way that you saw fit, how would you have invested that into your business?
Well, you gave me advance notice of this question, which gave me a little time to think about it. Uh, I think my first response would be I want to eliminate debt.
Yep.
Um, and we had made a lot of progress towards that by the time I sold the practice, but I didn't actually pay off my
Yep.
debt in total until I sold the practice. So that would have
Okay.
been number one. Let's remove debt. Number two, I think would have been a contingency fund to fund that depreciation account, or to always
Yep.
make sure we had a rainy day fund for whatever came up. But the other area that occurs to me in looking back now, had that happened then, was to do something for my employees.
Yep.
Um, I always felt during the time that I was there that we were never uh, in a situation to financially reward our employees the way I would have liked to.
Sure.
And we had various employees doing various things, and certainly nursing staff, medical assistants, receptionists, transcriptionists, because we didn't have voice recognition software. We recorded our dictated records and then somebody typed them up. Then we also had mid-level providers. We always had physician assistants. And so I would have liked to have had a way of rewarding them more for the work they did, because they also made sacrifices to do what we did.
Absolutely.
So,
no, that speaks to your heart as an individual, as a business owner. I know others who have felt the similar sense that they would have liked to have given more to their employees, myself included. I think that is something that it's hard in that time when there isn't or aren't those resources. So 100% agree with that. On the flip side, there are those that don't feel that way. So make some environments not as maybe as long lasting for individuals who choose to move to another place and find those people that they would like to work for. But well, I wanted to thank you for taking some time out to talk with me today. It's been a pleasure. And normally I would say if there was anybody who wanted to reach out to you to hear more about what you're doing, but this is a different conversation, being in your stage of life. So congratulations on being a retired physician and continuing to occupy your time with family, with friends, and giving back in other ways. So thank you again.
Thank you, Zach. I've enjoyed it.